Hello and welcome to the webinar today on networking in a post-COVID environment. I am Greg Weiss and I'm your presenter today. I'm looking forward to spending some time with you about this important topic, and want to be able to actually just take you through some of the content that appears in my book that I've written about networking in a post-pandemic environment. It's a very important topic indeed. Some reservations that some people will have about networking is that they just haven't started. And there's a Chinese proverb that I'd like to talk to you about just as a start, and that is that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. And that applies very much to networking as well. It's never too late to start. Last last webinar that I held was one where I shared with you how to structure up your content, your contact base, so that what you're able to do is you're able to then look at close ties, dormant ties, and weak ties. And what I then said was we'd talk about what to do after that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to recap on the presentation and get into the main content that you can be able to then enjoy. And I just want to give a little bit of housekeeping. If you can give me a thumbs up that you can hear me in the chat, as well as if you want to ask any questions, I'm happy to address the questions, but rather than interrupt the flow, I'm going to encourage that we do that towards the end. Okay. All right. Getting into it, networking, very important in these times. And to be involved with networking and to really get the whole purpose of networking, if you imagine it's just like any other relationship, and that is that when people really know you, like you, and trust you, then you're going to have what I call a KLT score, a higher KLT score. And then within that, people are going to feel comfortable to vouch for you. So if they feel comfortable with you, if they know you, like you, and trust you, a high KLT score, they're going to vouch for you within their own networks. And we cover that off in the last webinar. So in the last webinar, I also talked about what are close ties, what are dormant ties and weak ties. And let's just recap on that. Let's just take a typical example of, say, 100 contacts that you've got. And I'm going to suggest, say, 10 to 20% of them, out of 100, would be close ties. These are people who might be friends, family, work colleagues, people who play sport with on a regular basis. They're close ties. Dormant ties are people who have previously been people that were maybe close to you, and what they've done is they've gone to sleep, dormant. And so I would suggest that dormant ties are about 40% of your contact base. And then the majority of those would be weak ties. And an example of weak ties would be ones that you reach out to in LinkedIn. And frankly, the majority of my LinkedIn connections are weak ties that I'm looking to activate a little bit warmer to become closer and closer in their connection with me, closer ties. People then would feel that they know me, like me, and trust me, and you'd be doing exactly the same thing. Why is networking important? In the last webinar, I covered off that the hidden job market accounts for the majority of jobs that you would find. And so 20% of the job market is known to the public. It might be on Seek, it might be on any job board, it may be on LinkedIn, it may be advertised elsewhere. But 80% of the job market is hidden from the rest of us. It's through networking that we uncover this, much like that diagram there, which is depicting an iceberg. 80% of an iceberg is above the water. sorry, 20% of the iceberg is above the water, 80% is hidden. Same thing with the job market. And so networking will help you uncover what the hidden job market is. And what is important is that once you've classified your network into close ties, dormant ties, and weak ties, the question is what to do next with them. And let's assume that you've then met up with them and you started to reactivate your dormant ties, your weak ties, and connected with your close ties again. What you want to do is you want to be able to use a trigger statement in order for them to be able to think, this job would suit you for what you're looking for. And so a trigger is an important foundational thing for your job success. Now, I'm going to draw on the notes from my book, but I want to actually give you an idea about why a trigger is so important. So let me just read from my book here, and it is the purpose of a trigger is twofold. Initially, it serves as a succinct way to explain what you do. This is helpful both for when you're talking to a first-hand connection and when such a connection is making a mutual introduction to you. But for a moment, imagine a person you've warmed up and pitched to doesn't have a lead right at this second. What if instead the perfect lead for your job search arises a week from now, a month from now, or even later? In those cases, the importance of a trigger becomes paramount. A trigger helps your connection remember you, that you are just the person to introduce or to recommend. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through and we're going to explain about triggering and the importance of this. And one thing in terms of being remembered is around the 3 stages of memory, which are encoding, storage, and retrieval. And in the encoding stage, we receive and process information. Distraction is a large inhibitor at the encoding stage. And if someone doesn't understand the information that you are trying to present to them, they're going to be distracted trying to figure out what it is that you mean. I'm going to continue about storage from my book. In the storage stage, the encoded information is given a permanent record. If the encoded information wasn't clear, the kind of opportunity you're looking for, it either won't be stored or it won't be stored correctly. And in the retrieval stage, stored information is called back in response to a cue. That is the trigger for them to introduce you to make a referral. However, if your own trigger phrase was never properly understood, it's likely they won't think of you and the referral won't be made at all. So these are important things for you to remember, that we encode information, we store it, and we retrieve it. But what is important is that you are aware of those 3 stages. And I want to again recall an important statement which came out to me and made a huge impact on me some years ago. And a lady called Nina who worked for me, and I mentioned this in last webinar, but I'm going to reinforce it again. And she was a facilitator. She worked for me in my business, and she worked on a consulting basis. And usually it was once or twice a month. But even though my business was a big part of my life, it was a small part of her life. And the same thing was that her business is a big part of her life. And when she did consulting work for me, it was a small part of her life. And she reminded me that what was important was that our lives are big to ourselves, but small to other people. And so that's why triggers are really important, because when the right trigger is pulled, then the person will think, of course, I remember who you are. I'm going to refer you. So a big part of your life is your life, but small part to somebody else's life. And that's why the importance of a trigger. So what does make a good trigger? And what I have here is a number of different criteria which are important. And it is the following. We have reading clockwise. We have clear and concise. We have memorable and problem solving, free from jargon, that it's passes the hashtag test, and it's targeted. And I'm going to go and break this up into different sections. Let's go into clear and concise. And what I mean by that, the most important thing is that probably a good rule to remember would be, can a 13-year-old understand what it is that you do? And so let's, so a good rule of thumb is passing the 13-year-old test. And so whilst you might work on your KLT score, know, like, and trust, the best way for your trigger to be then recalled, a trigger statement, is the first criterion, and that is be clear and concise. The second one is being memorable and helpful. And in here I say, here's a little mnemonic or a little process for you to think about, which is, here's the problem, here's the solution, and here's the trigger. So let me give you an example of that. A framework is the problem, to listen for the trigger phrases that people use to identify a problem. A solution, why you are the right person to solve this problem. And then the trigger is using the problem, which are the trigger phrases, as well as your expertise to find the right trigger for you. So how can I give you an example of that? Again, from my book, I want to be able to give you something here. So when somebody, for example, says they're looking for a wedding florist, as an example, to partner with, and use triggers like a reliable florist, a wedding flowers, brides that expect the best, need a reliable vendor to partner with, that's the problem. Then the solution would be, the natural solution is to refer that person to, say, somebody like Debbie. It's a free plug for my wife, who runs a fantastic wedding business. But Debbie, let me continue. Debbie is a florist. This is the solution. Debbie is a florist who specializes in weddings and events only. And Debbie knows the drill with demanding requirements of weddings and events that never lets brides down. So the trigger, therefore, is when Debbie is creating her own trigger, she should aim to use one of these phrases or similar to help her stay front of mind and get those referrals. For example, Debbie's trigger might be flowers brides can count on, or reliable events florist, or something more creative like the fairy godmother of wedding flowers. Another one may be much more relevant to us in the employment market, would be around improving, say, if somebody wants to improve, if an employer wants to improve sales into supermarkets or petrol and convenience stores, the trigger phrases might be poor B2B sales, hit B2B sales targets, improve sales into supermarket chains. And the solution would be, a natural solution is to refer that person to somebody. Let's call that person Roy. Roy has managed a team of salespeople who sell to major supermarket chains. He knows how to get an in with those larger chains and then negotiate entry into that market. So Roy's trigger would be something to incorporate a variation of these trigger phrases, like his own trigger, like getting supermarkets to stock your products. So getting supermarkets to stock your products. So you can see here what we've done is we've identified the problem, looked at the solution, and then come up with a trigger phrase. So one of the pieces of homework I'm going to encourage you to do is to think about, what are the problems that people face? What are the solutions that you can offer? And then a trigger around that, those phrases. Okay, the next part of this is to do with what makes up a good trigger. Happens to be if it's targeted well. And there's a guy called Derek Coburn, and Derek talks about the following, that he suggests that and actually this is where I've got it from Derek, and it's to do with not being too vague whatsoever. So targeting is in fact something very, very important. An example of this would be that if somebody knows that you work in IT, it's way too broad. Alternatively, if what you do is you narrow it down to becoming, for example, customer facing in-house or systems IT or problem solving in cloud, that's far more targeted that people that can actually then recall about what those particular problems are. Okay, the next one that I'd want to get through to you about is steering clear of jargon. And every industry has indeed that. For example, again, the supermarket chain. It's a supermarket example with Roy earlier. FMCG. Do you know what that is? It actually stands for fast moving consumer goods, but not everybody would understand that. Or P&C, petrol and convenience, or HC is heavy construction, or ICT is information communication technology, and the list goes on and on and on. So what you want to do is steer clear of jargon and make sure that the solution is clearer for Joe Everyone or Mary Citizen to really be able to understand. And passing the hashtag test. Now, I love this term, and in the same way that that we are very familiar in Instagram or LinkedIn or Facebook with hashtags nowadays, hashtag trigger. What we actually have is I want you to be able to think. Imagine if a hashtag was being used, that when they think of you, there's a hashtag your name about the solution that you've got. So the hashtag test is, and I want to be able to draw on some information from the social media platform Hootsuite you might have heard of. And according to Hootsuite, a targeted niche hashtag is important for improved engagement. This idea works just as well for networking because you need your connection to be engaged with your job search. And like any good hashtag, your trigger should be concise yet clear, good representation of the article that you might be writing if you were posting an article on LinkedIn, and of course of yourself. So it may be catchy, but beware of being too clever. So an example might be, for example, in my case, is that that I'm a career coach, and it may not be clear to everybody what exactly I do, but when I tell people that I'm and often I've used this term, I'm the career accelerator, then it becomes crystal clear to people what it is that I'm doing, and it helps ramp up the chances of people being able to then think of me when they're wanting to refer me to people who need career acceleration. So the question I'd have to pose to you is, again, what might you be able to come up with in terms of your own hashtag? And so in terms of creating a trigger, I'm going to encourage that you very much look at the problem, the solution, and the trigger, and come up particularly with ways of testing this. And the best way you can test it would be going to people of least risk, and that would be your close ties. Perfect that message first, perfect that trigger first, and then start to reignite your dormant and weaker ties. So let's look at approaching ties and an initial connection. And last webinar, we talked about weak ties, the ones who you are less likely to get opportunities, less likely to warm up because they don't know you all that well, they don't like you all that well, they don't trust you all that well yet. Yet is important after all those statements. Don't know you well yet, don't like you well enough yet, and don't trust you well enough yet. And so the whole idea is to be able to actually warm up your weak ties so that they can become closer. And one of the things I'm going to give you is trigger statements or triggers or scripts to be able to warm those up. And so It might be, for example, a few. Let me read you a few scripts, and it might be that you might say, "Hey, your name popped up in my LinkedIn suggestions twice now. I'd be curious to reconnect." Or, "Hey, I bumped into your profile today. I'd like to expand my network on professionals in the whatever industry it might be." Or, "I came across your LinkedIn profile again." Or, "Hey, I'm responding to a post that you posted up." So there are many ways that you can warm up weak ties, and I've given you examples with LinkedIn, but you can do a similar thing, for example, by sending an article to somebody in who might be a weak tie. That would be of value. Again, if you want to be able to just reflect on this and go deeper on this, the first webinar had that content in there. And so the same thing with dormant ties. It might be about reaching out to those people and saying, and sharing something of value, sharing something that would create an opportunity for you to reignite the relationship that you used to have. Last week, the last webinar we talked about was about a range of dormancy that you had with your ties. And if they were only reasonably dormant, then it's very easy to wake those ones up by a telephone call or otherwise. If they're longer dormancy, it's going to take a little bit of work. But the nice thing with any of these dormant ties is most dormant ties are going to be happy to hear from you. And a script for approaching those people could be along the lines of, let me think here. I'm referring to my notes from my book, but let me just think about it. It can honestly be along the lines of, I saw an article, maybe think of you, or you could go onto their post, for example, or I should say their profile, and look at anything they've posted, or it may be an opportunity for you to be able to see what their company's been doing and reaching out to them and saying, "I see you've been involved in this, or I've seen your company's been involved with this. How about we reconnect?" And as soon as you can start to get the conversation rolling, the easier it is for you to be able to do this. So triggers are an important thing. Triggers are essential for you to be able to have your warm ties, so they're close ties, your dormant ties or your weak ties, remembering what it is that you want them to look out for you to in the marketplace. And as jobs are most likely found through networking rather than through any other means, your trigger statement's important. Remember the ideas of being, from the left to the right here, clear, concise, memorable, targeted, free jargon, and that they pass the hashtag test. A good way of being able to start to draft one of these trigger statements up is by this process of thinking what the problem is that prospective employers or anyone in the marketplace might have, with a solution that you can be able to provide, and then what might be the trigger statement that satisfies those conditions in the green circles in order for them to remember you at the drop of a hat. Remembering, as I've shared with you about Nina, that your life is a big part of your experience, but a small part of, say, Nina's. And Nina's life was a big part of her life, but a small part of, say, mine. But what we do is we want to remember it at an instant about what we both do. And so pushing the point home, you want to make sure that triggers allow somebody to understand in the small part of their life that you play, no disrespect to you, what trigger can you pull to help them remember who you are and what it is that you do. So let's move into some questions, and also what I want to be able to do is to encourage that you participate in our support group with any further content, any further questions that you might have. And you can see the URL there in order for you to be able to then be part of that. But that's in the link in LinkedIn, and it's invitation only or participant qualification only. Let's go back to the questions. And let me just see what we might actually have here. Okay, I have a question around the trigger statement just to make sure that we're making it very, very loud and clear. And that is to do with just making sure. Okay, so no disrespect to anybody here, but it's all about how somebody can remember you at the drop of a hat. Your trigger statement is designed for you to be able to be recalled very clearly. Too broad, for example, let me just drive this home. Too broad may be that if you just mention IT, then are you involved with cloud? Well, maybe you're not. Are you involved with systems? Maybe you're not. Maybe you're a coder. If you're involved with cloud and an opportunity came up and it's purely to do with coding, it would be the wrong trigger. So pushing that point home is to satisfy, is to be narrow. It might sound counterintuitive, but to be very, very precise about what things are. Let's bring this up to another analogy, and that is that if you're in the market for a car, yes, a car is has four wheels typically, but what type of car? So if suddenly we're looking at eco cars, then we're narrowing it down to a more precise niche. And if what we're looking at is purely battery oriented cars rather than hybrids, then what we're doing is we're coming down even more narrowly. So I could, if somebody's recommending the idea or thinking about the idea of getting into a car purely with a battery, then what I'd be encouraging that individual to do is to only look at one or two brands. And it's the same thing with a trigger. Okay, another question. How can I figure out if my trigger is clear and concise enough? It's a very good question. Thanks for asking that. I would say that as far as a trigger is concerned, you should test it with close ties first. This might be friends, family, low-risk people, where you can experiment with them, letting them understand that you're in the marketplace and you want to make sure that you can start to really effectively network. And so how would I use a trigger? By the way, pardon me, this is live, and I'm human just there. Just hold on a second. Actually, it's a hint that I need a glass of water. How would I would want to make sure that you're testing again with close ties and that's low risk. But I'd also be making sure that once you've tested that, then to feel comfortable articulating that and asking people in a week's time just to remember what that particular trigger was. So that when you're in a position that people are picking up the phone and saying, there's an opportunity in XYZ company, that you're not wasting your time and certainly not wasting the potential employer's time by being referred into the wrong job opportunity itself. Okay, I've got another question. How to present a trigger to someone who do not have the same professional context as you? The simpler, the better. Thanks for asking that question. If they don't have the same professional context, it's even more important not to be jargon orientated. People know people, and that's where the trigger comes in very importantly. So a profession may have the same opportunity for you. So for example, if you're in IT, let me use that example again. If you're in IT and the IT network contact has a job opportunity for you, fantastic. But if that's not available to you, and as I mentioned at the beginning of today's webinar, if they have to remember you in, say, a week or a month, you want to make sure that whatever it is, that they get it right and that they can recommend you to somebody within their network when they say, when they know you, like you, and trust you, they're going to vouch for you. And if they can say, I want you to speak to, say, Alvin on this because he has the best qualifications, then what would happen is that, by having that trigger, it allows the networked person to be able to then use their own network effectively to say, speak to Alvin because he's the right person for the job. So presenting a trigger to someone who doesn't have the same professional context as you might mean the opportunity to de-jargonize, but it also is about a trigger that allows in a few words only to be reminded about what you do, and therefore it can be enough to be able to then on-sell you to the network that individual has, whether they're a close tie, a dormant tie, or a warming up weak tie. Okay. Any other questions that people might have? The problem, solution, and trigger was a question as well. And I want to make sure that we're clear about this. So the only reason why people want you is because of problems that they have. We eat because we have a problem. It's called hunger. We have a phone, among other things, because we want to take good photos and we want to be able to communicate easily. So we actually happen to have these particular problems that we want resolved. Hand sanitizer, I've got plenty of them here, but why we have that? Because we want to make sure that we're clean. So just that's the problem. Okay. What's the solution? I've given you hand sanitizer as one example, and it might be a solution for keeping my hands conveniently clean. And so when I think of in the context of having this, when I think of that, I think of brands immediately thinking, okay, what is it that Dettol is going to provide me? And if you can see their trigger here, which is kill 99.9% of germs without water, is a wonderful trigger for me to understand what what that's all about. Okay, what this product's all about. And I guess that's a really nice analogy here about why you would want to have a trigger as well. And that is that when you think about hand sanitizer, there are 2 or 3 brands that might come to mind, and one of them happens to be this because of that particular statement here. Another question that I have is what to do with forwarded jobs by contacts that don't fit with what you're expecting. Well, that's outside of the trigger, but it's a very good question. And I would say that when they don't fit and what you're expecting, is I'd be approaching, depends on, let's take the example, I'm thinking out loud here. Take the example that somebody's referred you by way of email. I'd email them as a thank you and just let them know that this is outside of spec. But to thank them very, very much, I'd probably pick up the phone as well and let them know that you appreciate the referral, and to ask them a question about why they may have referred you for that particular job. And when you hear back that they haven't necessarily understood what value you can provide to them is, then you can help them refine that. And if you remember, what we had was we had the messaging of encoding, storage, and retrieval. We want to make sure that what we've got is we're encoding that message correctly, and that your contacts or your network stores the information correctly, so that when the time is triggered, that they can retrieve you from their files of people that they know and recommend you. Okay, another question is, what would you suggest is the most effective way of getting people to associate your trigger when they think of you? It's a very good question. What would you suggest is the most effective way of getting people to associate your trigger when they think of you? I would be encouraging that you don't just reach out once to your dormant ties, for example. So, in recent times, I've updated my LinkedIn profile, very recent times, and I changed it to become more of a byline about the value that I provide, but also who it is that I am. And I say that I'm the online outplacement pioneer and innovator with deep expertise in outplacement and employee onboarding. Now, that might sound like a mouthful, but that's actually within my LinkedIn heading and also my professional heading. And so anything that I provide, any content that I'm providing out there in the marketplace is one which is going to reinforce who it is that I am in, say, LinkedIn. It may also be in terms of content that I might be disseminating, also in a signature that I have as well. And so there'll be these different ways of being able to reinforce the message digitally, but also when it comes to face-to-face communications as well. And so an effective way of getting people to associate your trigger when they think of you is to remind people who you are, that you occupy that particular space. And so that the benefit is around reinforcement, around messaging through different channels, and just reminding people who it is that you are and what you do for a profession. More water. And when I talk a lot, as we all do, get a bit thirsty. Any other questions? Okay, just next steps. What I'm going to encourage you to do is to, for the participants who are watching this, please get into the Career 365 LinkedIn participant support community. Get active there. There'll be ways of engaging with the team from Career 365 and also among other participants. I'm going to be putting this presentation in the show notes as well, so that you'll be able to see and recall what this is about. And please just reach out to me through LinkedIn for any other questions. But I do want to thank you very much for your interest in today, and looking forward to reconnecting with you again on another webinar and through our community. So thanks very much for spending time with me. Happy networking.